All right, something that I get asked all the time, or something that I overhear, and it kind of drives me crazy, is this idea that projection mapping is a technology. And usually I'll be on set or on a project, and a client or someone will look over my shoulder and see me fiddling around with some sort of software, and they'll say, "Isn't the technology amazing?" And the idea here is that if it wasn't for the software that we were using, or if it wasn't for this new breakthrough in technology, we wouldn't be able to be projecting on things and yeah, getting these cool perspective effects and those sort of things. Well, that is a big misconception about projection mapping, and a lot of what makes it such a confusing medium for people to work in. This is actually not new technology, it's just a new technique. But that's not even totally accurate because it's actually an old technique. There's examples of projection mapping, a technique of basically interacting with architecture, interacting with physical structures that are not just flat planar surfaces, going back to the 1970s and 80s. Krzysztof Wadeczko is an artist that comes to mind who back in the 1980s was designing pieces that would interact with giant monuments in architecture. It was all done with slide projectors. There's a number of other artists that have done similar things. So it's not exactly new technology that's enabling that. And the camera and the projector are really very old technologies that we've had for hundreds of years. And so what's going on here? So the way to understand this is really something that I like to point out, which is that a camera and a projector are basically the same thing. A lot of people kind of scratch their heads and say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, let me explain what I mean by that. So here's our little example of our camera slash projector right here. So in the case of a camera, you've got your subject. Here's a nice little tree. You have a light source. In this case, it's the sun. And he's a happy little sun. And you have a lens, which is really important in this discussion. And what you have is light bouncing off of your light source or illuminating your scene. And you have a lens that is capturing your subject or your scene, passing through a lens. It's passing through a lens. Let's do it a little straighter there. Through an optical device, and it is focusing it onto this back plane. Or another way to think of it is it's actually projecting it onto this plane right here, which traditionally that was film or plates of different substances, or now it's digital chips and different things. So that's essentially how a camera works. You have a light source, you have a subject, you have a lens, and you have a back plane that you're focusing onto. Now, in the course of when you're doing projection, you have a lot of things similar, except it's actually reverse. Your light source is actually a lamp. So you've got your lamp back here illuminating your source, which is actually, in this case, it would be an LCD chip or a DLP chip array, a couple different technologies. But basically, here's your image. Right here, you have light passing through that, let's call it an LCD chip. It's being focused through a lens and projected out onto a screen surface. But really, it's exactly the same. It's essentially an inside-out camera. So why is that important, and why does that matter? Well, if you can understand that a projector is basically an inside-out camera and start to think of it in that way, projection mapping becomes kind of a simple thought process when you're thinking through projection mapping projects. It's really, really helpful. So let me show you an example of something that you can try without needing any special, particularly special software or tools. If you just have a simple projector and some sort of consumer camera with a zoom lens on it, you can try this out. Okay, so what you want to do is set up a projector in front of the ubiquitous stack of boxes projection mapping test scenario. And you want to shine a projector so that it's covering your scene. Not shooting super wide. If you have a projector that has a zoom lens, you want to go with something that's a little bit longer in throw. So positioning farther back and setting your zoom so it's a tighter focus on your subject or on your surface that you're projecting onto. And you're going to get something like this. You want to shoot a blue screen or a white screen or something so that it's just casting a solid color and you're seeing all of the outer dimensions, all the outer edges of where your projection is landing. Then you're going to want to take a DSLR camera, and it doesn't have to be a DSLR, but something with a zooming lens would be ideal. And you want to stick it right on top of your projector as close to the lens as possible. And what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to get a sense of looking through or down the lens of our actual projector. So if I actually go and move my view here to look through that camera lens, you can see that blue box is now almost perfectly square. And in this case, I'm projecting a 16:9 aspect ratio. So you'd end up with something like that. Your actual image would go outside of that. So what you would do is you would take a picture of this, able to see all your surfaces and your box and all those type of things. You would take a picture, throw it into Photoshop or GIMP or some free image editing program. You would crop it to the edges of your... you would take this and you would crop it to these edges here, and you would want to go right tight to the edges so that you have the same aspect ratio as what your source is. Then just take that image in Photoshop and start putting things onto different surfaces. You could trace some lines. Oh, those are bad lines. Wow. Okay, that's okay. Anyway, you get the idea. You would fill it in. You would maybe put some smiley faces on it. You would get, really creative. Maybe an angry guy would be kind of fun. Yeah, and basically you're going to end up with an image that you've basically just painted or overlaid on top of your image. Now, without using any special tools at all, take that image, load it back into, play it back through a computer or laptop, whatever you have, and play it back through the projector as it's set up. And that texture should land almost perfectly on top of the boxes without needing any adjustment. Now, you may need to tweak your, if you have a keystone adjustment, you might need to fiddle with that. Maybe a little bit of lens shift if your projector has that feature. Your projector and your camera lens are not going to be perfectly on top of each other. That's why you minimize that difference when you use a longer lens throw, because the relative difference becomes smaller between the lens and your subject. But the whole point here is basically just to wrap your head around the fact that what you're doing when you're designing anything for projection mapping is you're designing something through the lens of a projector. You're always looking out through the lens. So if you're working with software like MadMapper, and you use something like the spatial scan tool, it is capturing, it's reverse engineering basically this image looking through the lens of the projector. That's why you can take that scan, throw it into your software, and begin mapping over top of it without even looking at what you're doing at your structure, going back and looking at your structure, and to your amazement, everything lines up perfectly. So, but that is just one tool that is aimed at getting at that technique. The technique at the core here is basically understanding that you're designing for an image that's going through the lens of the projector and thinking of it as looking through the lens like you would a camera. So if you can think in those ways about it, it really becomes a lot simpler. Hopefully that makes sense to people, and this video is helpful. I will try and post some more later. Thanks.